Something is happening right now that feels bigger than politics, even though it's playing out through politics. In just a short stretch of time we've watched a pileup of shocks and escalations, dehumanizing rhetoric that spreads from the internet into the highest levels of power, talk of territorial grabs, major economic moves pushed through with barely any deliberation, and then the most sobering kind of escalation, a large-scale military strike against Iran, alongside leaders framing violence as if it were a sincere form of Christian witness. It's a lot to absorb, and for many people it's not just alarming, it's disorienting.
In this episode, one want to offer a spiritual diagnosis from within a specific framework. It's not a claim to have the whole picture, and it's definitely not meant as a replacement for political analysis. Think of it more like what might be going on underneath the politics. I'm going to speak from what I've been developing and working with for years, drawing from the law of one material, sometimes called the RA contact, and from a metaphysical model of human development through stages of consciousness. The basic idea is this. We may be living through a threshold moment, a liminal space, not simply a change of administrations or a swing in public opinion, but the kind of collective passage where an old epic of consciousness is breaking down and a new one is trying to be born. And if you've ever witnessed a birth, you know it's not a clean upgrade. It's pressure, it's mess, it's intensity, and it often involves what was hidden coming to the surface. In the law of one vocabulary, the threshold is described as a transition from what's called third density into fourth density. If those terms are new to you, don't worry. You can translate them in a fairly practical way. Third density is the stage where self-awareness is the main classroom. It's the school of identity, choice, and moral orientation. And there's something called a veil of forgetting, meaning we don't come in remembering our larger origins or the deeper unity of things. We wake up in a life with a name, a body, a culture, a set of fears and desires, and we ask the classic question, who am I? That question is not a mistake. It's the curriculum. Fourth density, in this model, is associated with a more heart-centered mode of consciousness, love and understanding expressed more collectively, more transparently. But here's the crucial point. The movement from one stage to another is not necessarily gentle. When more light arrives, it doesn't only illuminate what's beautiful, it also reveals what's unresolved. So to understand the present moment, we have to talk about the energetic architecture underneath identity and society. The model uses chakra language, but it's not just about individual spirituality. It's about how civilizations function too. In this view, third density is strongly shaped by what's called yellow ray reality. The world of groups, institutions, nations, tribes, ideologies, how the individual self relates to the collective structures around it. But yellow ray doesn't stand on its own. It rests on what could be called the lower foundation, red ray and orange ray. Red ray is the baseline of physical survival and safety, the body's sense of being able to exist. Orange ray is a realm of personal identity, self-concept, emotional patterning, personal power, boundaries, self-acceptance. Yellow ray then builds on that and becomes the arena of social power, hierarchies, group belonging, and the temptations of manipulation at scale. Here's the spine of the argument. A person or a culture can't navigate the complexities of group life in a healthy way if individual identity is fundamentally unstable or wounded. If orange ray is tangled, if people don't know themselves, can't tolerate their own shadow, can't hold boundaries without either collapsing or dominating, then yellow ray society becomes a stage where those unresolved identities act out. The unintegrated self doesn't disappear when it joins a group. It multiplies through the group. In the law of one framework, third density has a central task, making what's called the choice. Not a single decision you make once, but an orientation you form and deepen. Do you organize your life around service to others or service to self? That may sound abstract until you realize how the system is designed to force the issue. The friction between being an individual and belonging to a larger social world creates real moral pressure. The question becomes unavoidable. When I'm threatened, do I reach for compassion or control? When I have power, do I protect or dominate? When I'm afraid, do I widen my heart or narrow my world? But here's the problem, and it's a big one. That kind of coherent moral orientation requires a relatively stable sense of self. You can't choose clearly if you don't know who you are. You can't love well if you're constantly defending a fragile identity. And you definitely can't relate to other people as fully real if you're still trying to secure your own existence by pushing others down. So what happens if a civilization develops huge yellow ray complexity? Empires, nations, ideologies, advanced technology, massive institutions, without doing foundational orange ray work of self-knowledge and self-acceptance? You get what I'd call an orange ray logjam. You get backlog of unprocessed identity wounds that never got metabolized, just scaled up into social systems. In the RA material, a classic sign of orange ray distortion is power over another individual, relating to another person not as a person, but as an object, a non-entity, a tool, a threat, something to be used, controlled, or erased. And when that orange ray distortion gets dressed up in yellow ray clothing, tribe, nation, religion, ideology, it can become socially acceptable, even celebrated. But the engine driving it is still the same wound, the inability to recognize the other as another self. Now layer on the pressure transition in this model. Fourth density or green ray energies, energies that push toward the heart, have been intensifying for decades. And you might assume that means people get kinder. Sometimes they do. But if the lower triad isn't integrated, incoming heart energy doesn't magically bypass the blockage. It intensifies whatever is stuck. It shines into cracks. It increases the pressure until the distortion becomes visible. That's why I think what we're watching in the public sphere isn't just the worst of humanity getting worse. It may be something more like the underlying disease is surfacing. Things we could once keep half hidden are becoming impossible to ignore. And as terrifying as that can be, it also creates a possibility. You can't heal what you refuse to see. To name this collective pattern, I've used a term, the Great Bash. It's my shorthand for a planetary scale thought form, what some esoteric traditions call an egregore, a kind of momentum of shared fear, hostility, and justification that takes on a life of its own because we keep feeding it. BASH is an acronym. The first letter is Bellicose Attitude, the baseline worldview that life is fundamentally a fight, that the world is dangerous, and that safety comes from dominance. Underneath it is a whisper that never stops. You're not safe? Strike first. Then comes aggressive actions, behavior that flows naturally from that outlook. It can be personal manipulation, systemic oppression, or outright war. And here's the trick. Aggression tends to create the very reactions it fears. If you treat people like enemies, you often produce enemies, and then you point and say, "See? I was right." The third element is scarred and scared, the wounded foundation, trauma that was never processed, individual, generational, civilizational, creates hypervigilance. And hypervigilance makes cruelty feel like self-defense. At a personal level, we know the phrase, hurt people hurt people. The Great Bash is that principle operating at scale. And finally, the deepest distortion, hope through hostility. The belief that peace will come when the enemy is crushed. That salvation arrives by defeating the other side. It's the myth of redemptive violence. The fantasy that if we just destroy the right people, we'll finally be safe and whole. History has tested that story 1,000 times, and it never delivers what it promises, but it always promises. Now, one of the most revealing things about the current conflict with Iran is what it shows us in the mirror, because from this perspective, you can see two systems that look opposed but are built on remarkably similar spiritual structures. On one side, American leaders describing Iran's religion as a reason for war, speaking as though military violence is a kind of righteous witness. On the other side, Iranian leadership working with its own apocalyptic frame, its own sacred justification, its own story about defeating evil as a prerequisite for redemption. This is not me saying both sides are the same in every political or historical detail. It's something more structural. Both sides can be running the same spiritual software, the same hope through hostility program, only with different symbols and different scriptures. And when sacred language is used to sanctify domination, one of the most important insights is this. The sacred language doesn't transform the domination. It authorizes it. It gives the orange ray impulse a halo. It turns the old wound into a holy mission. The results are not theoretical. Civilians die. Children die. Communities are shattered. Soldiers die. And then the next leader rises with renewed vows of vengeance. That's the Great Bash keeping its own circuitry alive. Injury followed by retaliation, followed by deeper injury, all framed as a path to peace. If you want to see how this pattern functions inside Christianity, pay attention to the way crusade imagery and crusade theology can show up, sometimes openly, sometimes subtly. When someone treats war as worship, when the cross and the sword become allies rather than being held in tension, that's not just politics with religious flavor. It's theology in action. It's a spiritual claim about how God works in history, and it can be sincerely believed, which is part of what makes it dangerous. The Great Bash doesn't require cynicism. It only requires unexamined wounds and a story that keeps justifying the next act of force. And it's not only a Protestant problem or an American problem. As a Catholic myself, I have to say plainly, this pattern can move through Catholic institutions too. In fact, religious institutions are often especially vulnerable because they already have a vocabulary for the transcendent. If an egregore wants to dress itself up, it will borrow the most luminous words available. Within American Catholicism, you can see different styles of the same underlying dynamic. There's an aggressive mode, where the world is divided into enemies and allies, purity and corruption, and where redemption is imagined as winning a war inside the church, defeating the right people, shaming the right leaders, refusing to yield. And then there's a quieter mode that can be harder to name, the path of proximity to power. Not fiery attacks, but careful alignment, selective silence, maintaining influence, keeping access, protecting one's platform. In one mode, the Great Bash shouts. In the other mode, it smiles and looks away. The important point is not to build a list of villains. The point is to recognize a pattern that can live in any of us. It can appear as open belligerence or as refined institutional self-protection. Either way, the substitution is the same. Power maintenance replaces genuine service. So let me say what I'm not saying. I'm not saying one political party is the Great Bash and another party is pure. That's exactly the kind of simplification the thought form loves, because it recruits us through blame. The Great Bash is older than any party. It has visited every empire. It lives anywhere humans decide that the other is less real, less sacred, less human, and therefore expendable. What I'm saying is that in this particular moment, the Great Bash seems unusually concentrated in very visible centers of power, and the intensity may be connected to this threshold pressure, the sense that more light is arriving, and what's unresolved is being forced into the open. If that's true, then the visibility itself is a strange kind of gift. I know that sounds almost offensive when people are suffering, but spiritually speaking, what you cannot see, you cannot transform. In the law of one language, this is catalyst, not punishment, but the raw material for learning. Catalyst hurts, but it also clarifies. And then the real question becomes deeply personal. What do we do with a mirror? Can we look into it without turning the reflection into a weapon? Can we admit that the impulse to dehumanize is not only out there, but also in here? Because here's the trap. If we respond to dehumanization by dehumanizing the dehumanizers, we may feel righteous, but we're feeding the same circuit. If our hope becomes a defeat of the people we fear or hate, we've stepped into hope through hostility ourselves. That doesn't mean we become passive. It doesn't mean we don't resist injustice. It means we resist without being absorbed into the logic of domination. There's a difference between confronting harm and becoming addicted to the enemy's story. For me, as someone formed by Franciscan spirituality, the alternative image is not a baptized sword. It's Francis of Assisi walking into the Muslim camp during the Crusades to meet the Sultan as a human being, not to conquer him, not to humiliate him, not to force conversion at the point of a weapon, but to encounter him, to recognize personhood where the war machine demanded an enemy. That, to me, is Christianity's deeper instinct. Not redemption through destruction, but redemption through recognition. Not purchasing peace with someone else's blood, but finding a way to refuse to admit that violence can save us. If the Great Bash is, in a sense, something we created and collectively sustain, then it can be interrupted. That interruption won't come all at once, and it probably won't come primarily through national speeches or social media victories. It starts in places where we stop feeding the circuit, where we reclaim our own orange ray work, self-knowledge, shadow integration, boundary and humility, the capacity to see our fear without letting it drive the car. And maybe that's the most grounded spiritual invitation in a moment like this, to practice diagnosis without condemnation, to name the pattern without pretending we stand outside it, to hold a firm line against violence and dehumanization, while also refusing to become what we oppose. I don't offer this as a final word. I offer the way you might offer a map drawn from one angle of the mountain. Useful if it helps you orient, and completely discardable if it doesn't. But if it does help, even a little, then perhaps it can support the deepest work of a threshold moment. Seeing clearly enough to choose differently,